Hi, this is John here with you. We've got a 1997 Lincoln Town Car, you can see back there, that has developed a coolant leak in the intake manifold. So I'm going to do a quick video here. Hopefully it's short to show you kind of the problem and then how we replace it. Here's the engine. Car only has 321,000 miles on it, pretty much all original. But the coolant started showing up on the driveway, and I found the source of it was, I'm going to point with the screwdriver right here. This is where the coolant, you can see that, this is where the coolant comes into the intake manifold from the heater. And if you can see there's a crack in the plastic has developed, and it's just weeping out of here. There's a copper pipe here which has been molded into the manifold, and you can see there it's just weeping out. So in order to fix that, I tried the heater hose here, but that wasn't it. So the crack persists and the leak is still there, so that's going to cause us to have to pull the intake manifold off and replace it with a new one. I'm going to try to only give you the tough problems I found. All the sort of obvious stuff I'll try not to put in the video here to keep it fairly short. So I just got the fuel injectors out. You can see the rail is just sitting here completely disconnected. I was able to leave the EGR valve here plumbed in and just thread that cross pipe out from underneath here. A couple things though, make sure you got your blue tape on anything, because one of the things I did before I started pulling the fuel injectors out was to blow the compressor right here at each fuel injector port to try to get as much dirt as I could out of there. You can see it's not perfect, there's still a little bit of dirt in there, so we'll have to see what happens when we get that off. If there's any dirt down in there, we want to get that out of there. So definitely want to cover anything like this when you're blowing. Also wear safety glasses for sure. Some of that stuff will blow right back at you. So now we've got the fuel injectors and the fuel rail removed, and the next step is I still got my heater hoses connected here and here, so we're going to drain a little bit of coolant out of the bottom of the radiator and then shut that back off so we don't have to drain the whole thing, just to the point where it's low enough to pull the intake manifold off. So at this point I've pulled out all the spark plug wires, laid them to the side here. We have pretty much everything out. The bolts that hold the intake manifold in are right here, and there was a tricky one back in here. If you can see that one, there's a wiring harness back there that's kind of obscuring that one. I ended up using a U-joint and was able to pull that one right out by just pushing this wiring harness aside. So at this point I'm ready to go ahead and pull the intake manifold out. So I've just pulled the intake manifold off, and you can see there is what is remaining, the valley of the engine, and the intake ports look kind of dirty, but I don't believe I'm going to clean those out because I really don't have a way to capture any of the dirt before it just falls right into the intake passage. But we will need to remove those gaskets. You can see there, the reason being is the replacement part which I ordered, which is it's a Dorman part. You can see it here. Comes with the gaskets already molded into it. So here's an O-ring kind of installed here on the upper side throttle body, and then here you can see underneath we've got gaskets already in place. So got to get those other gaskets off and the surface is cleaned. There's comparison side by side. There's the old part. They're hopefully the same in terms of the interfaces, but they are a little bit different. You can see that in this part here, which was not actually original, but it was replaced by I think about 60,000 miles when the original one blew up and started blowing coolant all over. But you can see here there's these brass inserts. Over here, really no brass inserts. Hopefully that doesn't make a big difference. The other thing that was different was the coolant passage, where it was leaking before. On the old one here, you can see we've got a brass pipe that's molded into the plastic here. And you can see the diameter there it's straight all the way through. In the new part here, you can see this is all plastic, and they thicken that wall by reducing the inside diameter here. So hopefully that doesn't restrict the coolant flow too much. So next step is to clean up the top of the heads there and then install the new manifold. I spent about probably a half an hour using lots of paper towels to very carefully clean these mating surfaces without dropping dirt into the intake ports. Particularly, we can blow out the spark plugs holes later, so I'm not quite as worried there. But those intake ports and the coolant passages, like here, trying to make sure nothing gets in there, so I used lots and lots of paper towels. So I'd highly recommend kind of finding a position where you can get in under the hood here and get comfortable, and take your time so nothing falls down into those passages. And they're fairly clean right now, but I feel like, just to be sure, I'm gonna use a razor blade and scrape just to make sure that this is perfectly clean in here before we go to put the new intake manifold in. I've done the scraping. By the way, the scraper I use is basically just a straight razor like this, and keep very light pressure on it as you're scraping here, and just make sure you don't get the scrapings in the ports. And you're dealing with an aluminum cylinder head here, so just be real careful you don't scratch. All you're really doing is trying to make sure that surface is flat. You're not really trying to polish off any kind of staining, which you see here. That's really not a problem. Really just want to make sure that things are smooth. The O-rings in the new intake manifold will handle that kind of stuff. But what I found was most of the junk I was really scraping out was around these cooling passages. There tended to be more stuff there. But basically spent my time cleaning this off. Again, don't be in a hurry. Take your time. Make sure stuff doesn't fall into those ports. And now we're pretty much ready at this point to put the intake manifold on. So here's the new intake manifold. It's sitting upside down. I was reading the instructions that come with this. There's a little bit of fine print there, something that is important to note, and that is that you see this little pin right here? There was a hole in an alignment hole in the original cylinder head, and those were used to align. Well, in the new gasket, you can see that actually goes right through. See the new red piece of gasket goes right through where that hole is. And they tell you in the directions that if that's the case, then you should fill the hole in the cylinder head with RTV. So I'm going to have to put some gasket material in the head right there. So here's the head, and what they're talking about is this hole right here. It's really just an alignment hole. It doesn't go to anything. So there's one here, there's one down here, and then on the other side, same thing in the back here and in the front here. So there's really just four. All I'm going to do is put a dab of form a gasket in there right before I put the intake manifold on. Otherwise, you end up with a vacuum leak, and that could be a major problem. So here's what I used for the gasket material, and you can see here's an example of where I just tried to fill that hole and then have it stick up just a little bit there. So I did that for each hole. So when the gasket from the intake manifold comes and makes contact with that, hopefully we have a complete seal across there with no vacuum. So I've got the new intake manifold placed in there. I've got the bolts in here finger tight. Of course, we're using this. One of the things in this Dorman kit, they give you this spacer here, and if there's a little gap in here, if it's larger than a certain value, then in the original, then you need to use this. I did not need to use that, and I actually reused my old thermostat because it actually looked a little better than the one that came with the kit, because I had just replaced it about 2 or 3 years ago. So it's all in. There's a certain tightening sequence for the bolts going kind of back and forth in sort of a star pattern. So the other thing I did so far is I put these temperature sensors, pulled them off the old manifold, put them in there, used a little bit of that sealant to keep them from leaking. So next thing is we're going to tighten up the bolts in that special pattern that comes with the direction. Manifold is in. I noticed as I was tightening, they've actually got a little number by each bolt for that star pattern, just to really get it tightened down evenly. I went around the pattern probably 3 or 4 times, even though they only recommend 2, just to make sure everything was coming down snug. So it's all in there. And the next step is to clean up the fuel injector. The process of cleaning up the fuel injectors and the rail, and I am replacing the seals here. This is just the replacement seals, but I wanted to show you the difference between a fuel injector with 320,000 miles and one that I've cleaned. So say for example this one here, this one is untouched, 320,000 miles. This one I cleaned up. They look the same. Really the only difference is that I've got a new seal on this one, and this one's got the original seal on it. So just interesting to see. They don't really get as dirty as they seem to show you in some of the commercials for various different products. Fuel rail and fuel injectors are all clean, and I set them back up in here. It was actually pretty easy to get them in. You just kind of pushed a little bit, and I didn't really even need to rotate much. I did use WD-40 on the new seals there, and kind of put a little WD-40 on each one of them before I popped them in there, and they pretty much slid back in. And so now we're ready to bolt the fuel injector rail back on. And evidently you don't use the same bolts. They give you some hardware in the kit that's it's like a self-tapping kind of plastic screw that's going to originally the stud and nut that was used to hold the fuel rail down was this, and what they've got in this Dorman kit is this self-tapping bolt with a washer on it. So that's what we'll be putting up. The throttle body, this is where the EGR valve goes, and I've used that same razor blade to kind of clean the old gasket off of that. I did get a new gasket when I ordered the parts, so you can see I'm going to use that when I put it back together. Did some cleanup in here, cleaned that mating surface there, and I cleaned out a little bit of the gunk in there, and there was just a little bit in there too. So this throttle body is pretty much ready to put back on. One thing I'll note is, as I've gone throughout the project, is when you take a bolt out, sometimes it's hard to remember where they go. So you can just stick it back in there, and then you never have to worry about remembering where did it go. So once the bracket comes off, then you just pop the bolts back in there, and it makes things a lot easier, especially if the project goes over a day or two. The throttle body's back on. A couple things to note. This bracket back here that holds the two cables, one of the bolts that is now like a bolt like this with a kind of a sheet metal type screw. The actual bolt was a little bit too long, or the hole wasn't deep enough in the new plastic manifold, and so I ended up having to use like a Dremel tool and just cut off about the last 3/8 of an inch or so in that particular case. Another thing that didn't quite fit right, but was close, is this bracket here that holds the throttle cables. So it's really anchored here, but to keep it from vibrating, this bolts down here. Well, when I first put this back together, it didn't line up as it does now, and so I ended up just putting a wrench on here, open and wrench, and just bending that a little bit, and now it looks like it should fit just fine. I had to cut this side off too. Here you can see where I've cut it off, and if you look, you see how long that plastic riser is? Basically, you can even tell by looking that if you put the new bolt in, you can see right there that it's going to be too long. It's actually going to stick down into the air passage, and I doubt that they drilled the hole all the way through. So I think they just needed to put some shorter screws in with the packet. Modification I ended up having to make is, see, this is the stud that came off the original one, and those were replaced with with these sort of like a plastic screw, and that's seeming to work, except for here's a connector. It's supposed to be ground, so there's a couple unused threaded holes down here. So what I ended up doing was taking one of those studs and I cut it off short like this. I'm going to thread it in there and then use that to form the ground here. Okay, so things are pretty much back together, except for the connector, the boot that goes between the mass flow sensor here and the throttle body. While I had the alternator out, I went ahead and replaced the belt and the belt tensioner. And I put the alternator back in just because it was probably about 100,000 miles on the other belt. Even though the belt looked pretty good, I thought, well, I've got this apart, I'll just go ahead and do that too. So everything's pretty much done. One thing I'll note is that as I was putting these connections, the vacuum connections back on, like say these or this one here or this one here, I put a little Vaseline on the connector just to make sure that it slid on nicely and hopefully makes a better seal. So we're just about done. Just a couple of things to note. Right here, say for example, there used to be a stud there, and in this Dorman product they just put those bolts there. So you don't really have a place to stick this. This used to fit over that stud that was sticking there, but I don't think there's a real problem with that just sitting there. There's a couple places where that occurs, but should be okay. On the other side, I mentioned that stud I cut off, and you can see right here the ground. So it's all pretty much back together. Just make sure everything's tightened up, add coolant, and then we'll start it up and make sure it doesn't leak. So I just completed a test drive and I looked over everything and it does not appear to be leaking. So the things to double check are like the fuel lines right here, make sure those were connected. All the fuel injectors, nobody's dripping in there. And any of the coolant passages like down in here. Of course the coolant passage that goes into the intake manifold, so we're kind of looking down in there and just to see if we see any kind of coolant. And luckily no signs of coolant here, so looks like another successful repair. Time on this one was pretty long. I would say we're probably looking at maybe 10 hours, but I took my time, and I would highly recommend if you do this, take your time. Another thing to think about too is when you're first starting it, make sure the engine's hot. This is the project because you're taking things apart, and a lot of these rubber connectors, hoses, like this big rubber boot, all that stuff is so much more flexible when it's warm. So if it's cold, you might use a hairdryer to heat things up and make it a little more pliable. So that's it for this repair. Thanks for watching.